people who are looking for vengeance in different ways throughout this story.
Yeah.
Obviously, like the main one is Zemo, who I'm sort of, I feel a little bit cheated by this portrayal of Zemo. Like it shouldn't have for this character. They just shouldn't have called him Zemo because he bears absolutely no resemblance to Baron Zemo of the comics, and that's a shame because that guy is such an iconic Cap villain that he deserved. That character deserved a better showing than what this movie gave. Which is not to say that like the character that we have portrayed for us is a weak one necessarily.
No,
like I think he's easily one of the better villains in the MCU. You know, even though the scheme is a little bit overly intricate and ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, with Zemo, and this might sound a little comic booky and corny, but with Zemo, if you're not going to give us some degree of the purple mask and the sword, then why bother?
Yep. Right. Yep. You're absolutely right. Because this, and we've said this over and over again, I hope that I can stop saying it soon, but like what makes the Marvel movies great is that they totally run with the inherent goofiness of their source material.
Right.
Yeah.
Which makes it that more relatable to other people who've been like with it, like they're expecting these things. So like, yeah, it's nice, it's good.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right, Aaron. If you know, we need the fur-lined purple hood, and the sword, and like you know some sort of like evil Nazi mustache twirling,
right?
And and that's what Baron Zemo is about.
If you're going to give, in this case, if you're going to do it more than once, if you're going to give Loki his helmet with the horns, and you're going to give a more recent villain like Hela from the most recent Thor, a costume that is in line with not only her comic adaptation, but her
the mythological
animated adaptation from Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. If you're willing to do that, then why not do that with Zemo? And I think part of the answer is because they wanted this movie to be somewhat grounded like Winter Soldier was, but at the same time, wait a minute, we still got a technological version of Red Wing that was basically a drone, and that was believable?
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that aside. That aside, like at least the villain here is a little bit more memorable than others that we've gotten in the MCU. Oh, right, but I was talking about revenge. So you've got Zemo is looking for revenge. Now you've got Black Panther is looking for revenge.
Right, for his father.
I mean, you could also argue that towards the end of the third act, once the big reveal happens, that in the moment of that reveal, Tony as well.
Now,
and
that was the other. I knew there was another one, but I couldn't get to it.
Now, would you argue that Captain America is also getting revenge for Bucky in this instance? Because
on who?
Right, on who? On would that be Hydra? Would that be on who? Would that be on?
Yeah, I don't know that I would. I don't know.
Would you argue that?
I don't think that. I see, Daniel, I see where you're going, but I don't think that Cap would necessarily do that because it's so out of character for him.
Right.
Okay.
Like it just doesn't fit with him as, it just doesn't fit with what we understand
to be Captain.
His character.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
sorry, I wanted to throw that in there though because I had read something recently that he was being written as to be one of the people in Hydra. That was like a new rewrite, and I was like, I wanted to like throw that in there.
Yeah, that's a whole mess that we're just not even gonna deal with right now. I'll probably at some point. I know, and that was such a controversial run.
Right.
At some point, we probably will do an episode just talking about that story arc, but we're not going to get into that right now.
Okay, cool.
That's too much of a rabbit trail.
Well, then my bad.
That's okay. So yeah, you've got those elements of vengeance, but then interspersed with that, like there's so many, like, well, not so, I don't know if so many, but there was one really like. There's a couple of heartbreaking moments in this film for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of them is when Wanda and Vision are talking there in the kitchen, and she's about to go, and the way that he puts his arm out to stop her is like, and I was looking at it closely when I rewatched it because I remembered it happening, and I was looking at it, and it is so tender.
Yeah.
And he stops her with like with not even any force.
No, it was pure grace.
It's just such tenderness and caring, as he puts his arm out to stop her, but it's heartbreaking too because he's basically now showing that he has to keep her there, either willingly or unwillingly, and there's this juxtaposition and this tension in his character between his care for her and his responsibility to not let her leave.
Right.
Right. And it's one of those moments that makes you wonder, okay, if we have knowledge of the comics, we have an idea of where both of these characters are supposed to go.
Right.
How are they going to get there?
Yeah.
And is that even going to be able to happen to any degree in this film?
Right.
Yeah. Well, and obviously it didn't happen a ton. I think some really solid groundwork was built for that in this film. And just for anyone who happens not to know, in the comics, the relationship between Vision and the Scarlet Witch is a major one in the Avengers. And that gives rise to all kinds of really interesting stories, including House of M, actually, is sort of like tangentially related to their relationship. But the other really heartbreaking moment for me is like that big brawl between all the Avengers in the airport in Germany.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way that and the way that the music is orchestrated really like punctuates and drives home like just how tragic it is that all of these people are fighting.
Right.
Like it really made me emotional, and like the first time that I watched it, like I was just heartbroken, and like you want to just say like stop, like don't fight, like this is terrible.
Right. I was like that because it accentuated every single blow on a personal level with each character. Like you said, it was heartbreaking.
When we talked about this at the theater here in D.C. a few months after this film came out, one of the comments that came up more than once was, would it have been possible for a lot of this to be avoided if Tony and Steve were essentially able to somehow like sit down and talk this out through some sort of mediated discussion. I don't necessarily know if that's true, and obviously it wouldn't have made for nearly as good of a movie. But it
Captain America mediation.
Right. But I think that a movie like this, especially in connection to a movie like, say, Arrival, that also has Jeremy Renner in it, just highlights the importance of being able to, dialogue back and forth as opposed to. I mean, there's a line in the commentary for Civil War where one of the directors, one of the Russo brothers, essentially asked the question, can you have a scenario that essentially, a political story than just a political story, kind of like a lot of it was in the comic books that they, Civil War, that they shied away from in the movie, that essentially kind of comes to blows. And I think that had I been confronted with a question like that a couple of years ago when this movie came out, as opposed to being confronted with it today and kind of where things can sometimes fall politically, especially living and working in a city like Washington, D.C., the director posing that question in the commentary, I think, is much more poignant today as we're having this discussion than it might have been when the film originally came out.
Well, I think that's a really fascinating question because as I was rewatching the film, like I see a couple of there are a couple of focal points here where like one moment of there. Who was it? There's a motivational speaker or something out there who talks about moments of disproportionate influence. Where I was at the Global Leadership Summit one time that the Willow Creek Association puts on, and he was talking about it's like a personal interpersonal conflict, and sometimes in relationships you have what he calls moments of disproportionate influence, where at this key moment, your reaction one way or another is going to set the course for more than you would think, based on just this one moment. And there are a couple of these in this movie where, Stark overreacts, and there are a couple things where Cap overreacts. Right. And that keeps the story barreling forward in this really tragic trajectory. And for Cap, as far as I can tell, like the key, the pivotal moment of disproportionate influence is when he hears that Tony is keeping Wanda, kind of locked up there at Avengers Tower.
Right.
And if he could sort of get out of his own way there for just a second and not overreact at that, then the whole situation is diffused.
Right.
But he couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like going back to Age of Ultron, which precedes this. There's a couple of moments in Age of Ultron. One at the farmhouse when the two of them are talking and they're kind of going at each other, and Tony's got the axe and he's cutting the wood, and Cap's just ripping apart the logs with his bare hands. And there's that moment where they're kind of arguing, and in the middle of them arguing, Cap kind of rips the log apart, and then a little bit later, I think it's a little bit later, when they essentially have that fight. I think it's in the lab in Seoul in Korea, where they find out that he's trying to create, vision and put Jarvis into vision, and then the possibility of that accentuating the direness of the situation that they're already in, and everybody starts to fight, and you see Cap and Tony come to blows even then. I think it's pretty poignant foreshadowing.
That was great foreshadowing.
Yeah, Civil War is going to happen, and this is just the beginning of it.
Yeah, I love that line that Cap has when they're working on the wood pile, where he says, anytime, and I forget exactly how it's phrased, but basically, anytime you try to preemptively, win a conflict, innocent people are going to get hurt.
Right.
And that was really interesting.
Were there a couple of other? You talked about this idea of moments of disproportional influence. Do you think that there was a particular moment or two that's focused more on Tony?
for him, you know, he's on